I think we're going to start. Can everybody hear? Okay. I have to hold back from thinking I'm actually teaching a class and asking everybody to move down from the back and put their computers away, which is usually the first thing I say when I come into a class. I never quite know what people are doing in the back other than being ready for a quick escape, which I don't think you'll want to make, but you may want to make. Anyway, thank you all for coming. We're going to take up somewhere between 60 and 90 minutes of your time talking about a subject that the four of us think is super exciting and super fun. Most people wouldn't give it a second thought. As somebody said to me as I walked up here, I was worried that people wouldn't be interested in this, and they looked at me and said, if people come to hear about it, these people must be interested in the subject. So I'm assuming you guys, just by self-selection, do want to hear about trash, and that's what we're going to talk about. I'm going to give you a very brief introduction and overview, and then I think we're going to spend most of the time talking about this as a panel and answering questions from you guys, and the panel that we have here is going to also ask some questions that I'm going to throw at them. So we're really lucky to have three of the city's top, quote-unquote, garbage girls. Marcia Bystryn, who is president of the New York League of Conservation Voters, and in that capacity deals with lots of other issues. But this happens to be one of her favorites, and I guess the thing that they have in common is they all had pieces of their career at the Department of Sanitation. So that gives them a certain credibility. Then again, none of them are now at the Department of Sanitation, and that gives them a certain license to talk and be honest and thoughtful. So Marcia is sitting on your right. Venetia Lannon is in the middle. Venetia actually worked with me when I was at the Economic Development Corporation. I poached her from sanitation. She really spearheaded the city's solid waste management plan and is now working for the state for the Department of Environmental Conservation, which, among other things, issues permits for garbage facilities and many other types of facilities. So she's been able to maintain her interest in garbage. And Samantha MacBride, who recently left the Department of Sanitation, who spent a bundle of years in the recycling division there and is now a professor at Baruch College. So before we turn it over to them to sort of talk a little bit about what their favorite part of the world of garbage is, I just wanted to run through a very brief history, except it's not coming up on the screen, Gavin. Is that? There it is. Okay. So here we go. So this is a sort of 100 years or 120 years of garbage history in 2 slides, so very, very quickly. Just by way of background, for those of you who don't know, there weren't street cleaners for a long time in this city. There were animals, basically, that ate garbage. But they finally did get a department in the late 19th century, a sort of quasi-military Department of Street Cleaning and Sanitation, set up by a very cool guy named George Waring. I won't go into all the history because those of you who have looked at some of the books I do know that I love the history. But what I want to focus on here is the fact that the policies on garbage and how we handle waste have changed a lot from time to time. At the outset, we dumped the garbage in the ocean. Once that was stopped in the 1890s, funnily enough, recycling started, and really sophisticated recycling that people don't sort of imagine happened in the old days did. That food waste was actually segregated and made into fertilizer. Some types of rubbish was salvaged, and ash, and of course there was a lot of ash at that time, was actually landfilled. And folks were expected to segregate their waste, and they did. And they did that for almost 20 years or over 20 years. And I think it pretty much stopped around World War I. I'm not entirely sure why, but at that point, incinerators were built to handle a lot of the city's garbage. And ocean dumping started again. Up to a much more recent part of history, which really informs what we're going to talk about today, garbage has become the sort of source of a lot of controversy in terms of where it goes and how we dispose of it. Some of you may have heard about controversies about incinerators at the Brooklyn Navy Yard. That controversy raged on for years, from 1979 until, I don't know, about 20 years later when they finally decided they couldn't build it. The piece that really, I think, has informed all of 4 of our careers in one way, shape, or form has been the requirement that the city have a plan to dispose of its garbage, and be able to articulate where it's going to be handled and how. And that actually came out of a state mandate in 1988 that required municipalities across the state to know where they were sending their solid waste. In addition, there were laws in the late 1980s about recycling and mandated recycling. And this is all sort of leading to the cities need to come up with a plan to handle its garbage. While the city was cogitating about what it should do with its garbage, Mayor Giuliani almost overnight closed Fresh Kills, which was the major landfill that was taking most of the solid waste from the city by barge. Once that landfill was closed, the waste had to go somewhere and essentially moved out of the city, largely by truck, to landfills in a variety of places. And that's still, at this point, the way most of it is moving. That's not necessarily the way it will be moving in the future. That's the way it's moving today. At various points, the recycling that had been instituted was suspended because it actually costs a lot to collect recyclables, because it's a separate collection from the waste. And at various points, the budget has sort of forced recycling to be stopped and then started again, which is what happened between 2002 and 2004. And now recycling, one hopes, is here to stay with a brand new facility that I know Venetia worked on very hard in South Brooklyn, which will handle the waste. How much garbage do we have? So we're here today. There is, on any given day, somewhere in the order of, if we just talk about residential and commercial waste, holding aside construction and demolition, debris, there's about 20,000 tons a day. About half of it is what the Department of Sanitation collects, which is residential, institutional, and government waste. And about half of it is collected commercially by the carters that you see running around. And the history of why commercial waste is collected in one way and residential waste is collected another way is the topic of a whole nother lecture. But that's the way we do it here. We have a bifurcated system. Some of it is public and some of it is private. It's a lot of waste. If you look here, you can see how much is collected by private carters and how much is collected by the Department of Sanitation. And it's, vast amount. We're talking about, 4 million tons a year just in the sort of residential waste that the Department of Sanitation handles. So it's a big volume to have to move every day somewhere, and that's really the point I want to make. One of the things not to forget is that there is a variety of types of recycling. We're back to recycling both paper and bottles and cans. The cost of that recycling program varies at any point, not simply because of the labor costs of collection, but because of the value of those recyclables in the aftermarket with shifts in worldwide markets. So the cost of that program at any given time versus the revenues will change. One of the things that's happened most recently, and if you don't follow garbage, you might not know about it, is that the city finally got its act together and got an authorized solid waste management plan, which is really a 20-year plan for how the city is going to handle its garbage. The core part of that plan, after much ado, was a decision to get these garbage trucks off the road that have been handling the material that used to go by barges to Fresh Kills in Staten Island, and actually send them out again by boat through the marine transfer stations. For those of you who have come down the West Side Highway, not far from Columbia, just adjacent to Riverbank, you may have seen a marine transfer station there. There's another one on 59th Street on the west side. These are the facilities that at one time handled all of the city's garbage and at this point are handling very little. Part of the plan envisions refurbishing them to, again, become waterborne transit points, but instead of having the waste move out in open barges, put it into containers and move it out essentially to landfills in a containerized form. The big idea here is really to reduce the 18-wheelers and the big truck traffic that's moving through the city because the garbage is moved from homes to transfer stations onto bigger trucks to move out of the city and ultimately to landfills out of state. So the primary location for most of city's garbage is landfills. They are not in New York State, generally they tend to be in Virginia, Pennsylvania, out-of-state places that take the money, and the city pays tipping fees for that. Just to give you a sense of where everything's going, the idea is to take the 84% of the residential waste in 2006 that's moving by truck and reduce it dramatically, so that almost all of the city's waste will move out of here in a more environmentally friendly manner by rail or by barge. It's not easy to do. It's very expensive to do, and I know Marcia is going to talk about that. But for a variety of reasons, it was felt that that is the right policy answer. The other piece of this, which we'll talk a little bit about at various points, is how you do that and where you do that from, because the location from which you export your garbage is very controversial and very political, because of course you have trucks coming in and either boats or rail cars going out, and garbage is not considered a particularly friendly commodity to have next door. The plan that was approved in 2006 envisioned garbage transfer stations, these marine transfer points in every borough. It was meant to have everybody take care of their own garbage, thinking of the city not as a city, but as 5 boroughs, each of whom needed to take care of their own waste. So right now, the plan that is being implemented by the Department of Sanitation at a fairly great capital cost is one that looks to rail cars and to boats to essentially move the garbage out of the city to its ultimate destination, which again is primarily landfills, and that's one of the things we'll talk about, because most of this stuff just goes into holes in the ground and sits there for a very long time. There's a certain amount that gets incinerated. I think it was about 10% of the city's waste is incinerated in Essex at the plant that's not far from Newark Airport. And then there's a certain amount, obviously, that's recycled. And what everybody's trying to do is increase the amount that's recycled and not tipped into the ground. So that is your 10-minute potted history of where we are with garbage. At this point, what I'd like to do is just let each of our speakers introduce themselves and also talk a little bit about the parts of the waste world that most interest them, and then we'll come back and start asking some questions. So I'll let Samantha start.
Thanks very much, Kate. I'm Samantha MacBride. I'm an assistant professor at Baruch College School of Public Affairs, and until very recently, I was deputy director for recycling at the Recycling Bureau, Department of Sanitation. One of the things that I think it's very important for people who are interested in reducing waste and diverting waste from landfills in New York City to understand is the underlying composition of the waste stream. We have a lot of very detailed information about that with regard to the trash that the Department of Sanitation collects from residents and institutions. So I'm going to talk about that just for a moment. As you know, we have a curbside recycling program going in this city, and we have had that since 1989, although there was a temporary suspension of parts of it in 02 and 03. And that program asks or mandates that residents and institutions recycle certain materials, such as all sorts of paper and cardboard, any type of metal, pretty much most kinds of glass, and certain types of plastics. Now, these materials in total add up to 34% of everything that people discard. And this is a very important percentage to keep in mind, because what it means is that if every New Yorker recycled perfectly all of the time, our recycling rate would be 34%, meaning we would not be keeping even the majority of materials out of landfills. So we need to think beyond the current recycling program that we have, in my opinion, think beyond ideas of increasing participation in it to how we can address other materials. And in that regard, I want to talk about, I'll just briefly mention 2 other really important statistics. And that is that 62% of the materials that are going to landfill or incineration right now are materials that are biogenic in nature, meaning they're made from natural materials. They have an ability to rot. And this is important for a couple of reasons. One is when they're in landfills, they're going to be releasing methane, which is a potent greenhouse gas. Another is that they would be potentially amenable to composting on large scales. And a third feature of biogenic materials is also that they would be amenable to conversion to fuel or energy, along with another large fraction of material going to landfills, which are plastics. Plastics, like biogenic materials, contain carbon, and they have that in common, and that makes them suitable for consideration in this new area of converting wastes to fuels, or older areas of waste to energy. So I've thrown out some key statistics. I'll leave it at that, but maybe we can take them up as we go on.
Great, thanks. I'm Venetia Lannon. I'm the Regional Director for the New York State Department of Environmental Conservation, the Regional Director here in New York City. And I thought that given that our agency, I mean, as Kate said, DEC is responsible for permitting and overseeing all of the solid waste management facilities in the state of New York, including transfer stations, landfills, and resource recovery facilities. But I thought what might be interesting to talk about this evening is, for the past 3 weeks, we have been knee-deep, literally, in the after effects of Hurricane Sandy. And I thought I might share some stories with you from the emergency debris management mission that's going on right now, because they're really, I think, illustrative of some of the themes that we deal with in solid waste all the time. And those are transportation, separation, and incineration, not in any particular order of importance. But what I think a lot of people don't realize is the mountains of debris that Hurricane Sandy caused. And early on, the Department of Sanitation turned to FEMA, and FEMA in turn turned to the Army Corps of Engineers to take over an emergency mission to handle the debris that has come out of Hurricane Sandy. And very quickly, emergency temporary staging sites were set up in parking lots in Midland Beach on Staten Island, Jacob Riis Beach in the Rockaways were some of the bigger ones. And the trash just started coming and coming and coming. I mean, if you could imagine, people are emptying literally the entire contents of their home onto the sidewalk. They are putting, the pieces of their homes onto the sidewalk. And very quickly, we had literally mountains of garbage in uncontrolled environments in parking lots in these areas of the city. And the material was really coming in more quickly than we could get it out. Even though we were issuing emergency authorizations to transfer stations to up the tonnages they could take, operate around the clock. And what was interesting to me was the Department of Sanitation, having a lot of experience in moving material by water, as Kate was saying, very early on said we've got to get a barge operation going. And in Staten Island, we reactivated Fresh Kills landfill as a barge export location. And if you can picture a tugboat and it's towing 4 barges, if you can picture, I mean, I think you've seen barges going up and down the Hudson River. It's about the equivalent of 600 trucks, or more, depending on how the barges are loaded. So we immediately saw the piles in Staten Island start to dwindle, whereas before we had sort of trucks trying to make it down roads and pick at this pile a little at a time. When we were able to just scoop huge amounts onto barges and send that material via tug up the Hudson River to facilities that could then unload it. Moving waste by water is the best way to move waste in the city, and we have the resources to do that. And I think it's always important to remember that whatever the solid waste management plan turns out to be, it needs to rely on water because it's the most efficient way to move material in the city. The second theme of separation was very interesting in that, so you have this sort of, if you can imagine, literally like a tide of garbage coming at you. Very early on, the EPA said, we want this to be the greenest recovery to date. And I very much respect that sentiment. And they mobilized their own mission of personnel to sort household hazardous waste out of these mountains of material. And I was out there at the landfill with my commissioner, and when I say mountain, I mean probably 1 million cubic yards at the end of the day will be a conservative estimate of the amount of debris that we're talking about. And that's not counting sand, which blew off the beaches, or wood waste, which I'll talk about in a moment. And these very well-intentioned contractors from the EPA said to me and my commissioner, we said, well, how are you planning to segregate this household hazardous waste, looking at this mountain of crushed refrigerators? I mean, tragic, really. I mean, people's literal soggy, mangled lives in front of you. And they said, well, we're just going to sort the piles. And we're like, well, what are you going to sort out of the piles? And they said, well, canisters of bleach and paint. And we kind of scratched our heads. And again, I don't say this cynically. I don't want to take away from what I think the EPA was trying to accomplish, but they abandoned this mission because it's again, another theme of solid waste in the city is any policy you have to try to recover material has to be in scale engaged to the flow of waste. And the flow of waste in the city is really a miraculous thing, and in a storm, it's a scary thing. So that's sort of a thought on separation. Incineration, which turns out to be the I word in New York City. I'm looking at Professor Themeles. Is become, I think, such a taboo. The notion of thermally processing our waste, as it once was, as Kate mentioned. And we had a very interesting run-in over the past couple of weeks where another debris stream from this storm, which you just have to see to believe has been the amount of wood waste. We had about 200,000 cubic yards, and it's been stockpiled out at Floyd Bennett Field, which is an old aviation facility out in the Rockaways. Luckily, a very isolated location. But just literal mountains of wood waste, and we're constrained as to where we can send it because we have Asian longhorn beetle quarantine zones and blah, blah, blah. And the market was literally flooded. It's not a good time to be, nobody's landscaping right now. There was a glut of this material, and the Army Corps said, well, in other parts of the country, we use what are called air curtain incinerators, which is a very interesting piece of equipment. It's like a shipping container with a ceramic lining, and it burns at a very, very high heat, which produces a relatively clean burn. The backlash from a number of environmental communities and the concern, again, from the EPA, not misplaced concern. Again, I don't want you to think that I'm being cynical about this, but you would think I don't know what you would think we were doing when we were proposing to incinerate some of this wood waste, because we had exhausted reuse outlets, and it simply was not feasible to move the quantities that needed to be moved. And what was interesting, we had the first burn today, and it burned relatively cleanly, and it'll be very interesting to see the data. The EPA has set up 8 monitors measuring what's called particulate matter at 2.5 microns, which is the stuff that when you breathe gets in your lungs, and we are very concerned about. But the Department of Environmental Protection ran an analysis without the data just to say, okay, let's look at the emissions from burning this wood versus the emissions of trucking it to reuse outlets. And the PM 2.5 was orders of magnitude greater for the trucking than it was for the incineration. But the sort of the emotional alarm and concern around incineration in this city, I think, shapes a lot of the debate about waste management in ways that I think are interesting and need to be addressed if we're going to talk rationally about how we recover energy and how we recover materials from the waste stream. So I'll leave it at that.
Great. Marcia?
Yes, I'm Marcia Bystryn. I'm the president of the New York League of Conservation Voters. I just wanted to frame some of the policy elements that shape almost any discussion of solid waste in the city. And it's always a trade-off, again, I'm simplifying for effect, between the environmental impacts, the cost, and equity. So at any moment in time, you can sort of assess the system. In the bad old good old days when Fresh Kills was open, actually was a very elegant system, I think. It was one of the most elegant systems because the garbage in this city, residential garbage, went by truck to marine transfer stations on the water and floated down to Fresh Kills where it was disposed of. It was relatively cheap. We owned our own facility. It cost the city very little. There are environmental impacts of any large landfill, and that was clearly an issue. And then there was the big issue of equity. And anybody in this room who's from Staten Island knows this. The fact that Fresh Kills was in Staten Island and was the ultimate repository of most of the city's waste defined and defines the psyche of Staten Island, I would argue. And when Mayor Giuliani shut down Fresh Kills, literally like that, the city had to scramble in terms of what they were going to do with that waste. And the interim plan resulted in 2 communities in the city receiving almost all of the waste. One was Newtown Creek, and the other was in the Bronx, South Bronx. Virtually all the waste in the city first would go to those transfer sites and then be trucked out to landfills or Essex, and also some of the waste goes to a waste-to-energy facility in Hempstead. That clearly was a system on the equity front, which was terrible for those communities. On the environmental front, the heavy reliance on trucks was terrible, and quite frankly, it was expensive to boot. So a solid waste management plan, the city finally came together and passed a solid waste management plan. The solid waste management plan explicitly was intended to address equity issues, environmental impacts of the system, and in theory, cost. And what it entailed was those marine transfer stations that had been shut down after Fresh Kills closed. Because remember, after Fresh Kills closed, there was no place for those barges to go. Decided the best thing was to retrofit those marine transfer stations for containerized garbage, as well as some various sites for rail export, containerized rail export. It was also animated by a sense of equity. All boroughs, no borough was going to suffer more than another borough. So there were transport facilities in every borough, which addressed the Staten Island concern. It addressed the concerns of much of the environmental justice community that had really suffered, those communities around Newtown Creek and in the South Bronx. And it was applauded by many. It appeared to be a very rational plan for moving things forward. I would argue, though, and this is sort of my last thought, and it's something people ought to think about who are actually interested in public policy right now, that it may in fact be time to take another look at that solid waste management plan, running it against the issues, again, of equity, environmental impact, and cost. I would argue, let's talk about environmental impact. The environmental impacts are of 2 kinds, let's say. One is the traditional environmental impacts of particulate matter, PM 2.5. These are sort of the traditional set of things the environmental community has cared about. Then you have the climate issue, which is the second package of environmental concerns. And that is, what are the CO2 emissions of whatever your system is? You know, right now, we are transporting our garbage vast distances by rail and by truck with tremendous impacts, both from the CO2 perspective and from the air quality perspective, coupled with the fact that landfills, even state-of-the-art landfills, have both methane emissions and have some degree of negative environmental impacts. The last piece here is a cost issue. The system or the costs of this solid waste management plan have gone up exponentially. And I just want to cite the Citizens Budget Commission. I don't know, is anybody here from CBC? The Citizens Budget Commission. 2 people. Yeah. So you can jump in when I misquote you all. did a terrific report, I think. You know, whether everyone agrees with all the conclusions or not, the analysis is really top-notch, entitled Taxes In, Garbage Out, and really does, I think, an excellent analysis of what the costs of the current system are. And I just want to cite two things. One, in terms of the capital costs of building the new infrastructure for the solid waste management plan, which is really retrofitting the MTSs and building the other transit facilities, transport, were originally projected to be $545 million and are now, most recent projection is $970 million, and that's going up. And then on the issue of what the cost per ton is going to be for long-term disposal, in 2011, the cost per ton was 92. In 2016, it's projected for 135. And the overall total export cost in 2011 was 300 million. The projected 2016 cost, we're only talking 5 years here, is 448 million. So there is a serious question here in terms of the broader context of the city's budget, whether this is sustainable. And what I want to come back to is there needs to be a robust discussion of what the options are for waste disposal proximate or within the city, because a major cost is always going to be your transportation cost. So I think we're sort of open for a conversation. We should be open for a conversation about how to address this cost issue, the environmental impacts of long haul, and quite frankly, the possibilities of new technology for siting disposal in city.
That's great. I'm really glad we sort of you went there, because one of the things I just want to make sure for those people who don't do this every day, you know, as we think about where waste could go, just in my own mind, we've got the sort of traditional place, or it's become the traditional place, which is landfills. We've got recycling, which actually pulls it out of the waste stream. And we've talked about incineration, which is, of course, the burning of garbage. But one of the things that, you know, one of you guys might want to touch on is, are there other methods for disposing of it? And why aren't we, or are we, looking at them in terms of their potential for the future? And I know, Samantha, you touched on this a little bit, but clearly there are cities around the world that are doing more innovative things in terms of reducing the amount that is left to go into landfills, or producing energy in different ways out of the waste stream. And this city has not yet been able to really get to go on that, and I'm just interested in exploring why.
I mean, let me just throw this out, because I actually have a position on this, which has marginalized me in the environmental community. There are, in fact, I mean, you know, 3 different things the city probably is and should be considering. One is additional waste to energy, utilizing additional waste to energy facilities proximate to the city. Do I think you can ever site a waste to energy facility in New York City in the 5 boroughs? No. But proximate to the city, you could. The second is anaerobic digestion, where there are a number of places. In fact, the city has actually had conversations about this. An RFP went out for some pilot projects. That doesn't seem, I'm not quite sure what the status is, but my sense is at the end of an administration, they simply don't have the drive to make any of this happen at the moment. And the other are a whole array of new sort of thermal processing technologies. The real question is how ripe they are at the moment, what the current cost is, but all over the world, people are taking a look at these. And I think that, getting back to my notion that we have to start looking at ways to dispose of garbage more proximate to the city, you know, these are all potential options.
I would add to all of those the notion of trying to diminish the consumption of certain extremely problematic substances, in particular things that lead to household hazardous waste, or certain plastics that are very difficult to recycle, using policy mechanisms that are in place in some of the best recycling cities of the U.S., namely fees and, in some cases, bans on certain material. It's very politically difficult to counter industrial opposition to these policies, but when you make them across the board, people adapt very quickly, and they're far more effective than voluntary pleas to people to reduce their personal consumption. So I'd add that as well.
Yeah, I would echo that. I mean, and I think also to the extent that we have architects and planners in the room, I think that the design of products and the materials that are used is so important and so often I feel overlooked. And when you're on the back end and you're seeing a house come down in one wet piece and the toxicity associated with it, whether it's asbestos or certain kinds of other toxic chemicals that are used as adhesives, to the extent that people are designing and building with cleaner materials, then we don't have to deal with it on the back end.
One of the things, before we leave, I was really interested in what Venetia was talking about in terms of the experimental burn that went on today. And I always think of these sort of cataclysmic events as offering opportunities to shape policies that have not really been able to move forward. And I wonder if you think that some of what's happening here in Sandy, whether it's the emergency permitting of special sites, special barges that are being set up, special forms of burn that actually are turning out to be not as dangerous as people might have thought, will in fact inform a debate going forward that will be different than the very static debate that's happened to date. And I know it's new and nobody really knows, but I'm sort of curious as to what you think the potential is here for changing the tone of these issues.
Yeah, I think it'll be very interesting to see. I think at a minimum, it's been interesting that, Kate, as I was saying to you back when we were working on the solid waste management plan, the notion of taking an open barge, meaning the waste is not containerized, it's just open and it's netted or it has some kind of cover, and sending that up the Hudson to a community to unload it. As you can imagine, we didn't have many people knocking down our door saying, oh, sign us up. But again, that this storm has sort of opened some doors, and I don't know, maybe, again, do those doors shut immediately after the emergency is over? That that some of these communities and some of these port facilities that have been unloading uncontainerized. Now again, it's not putrescible. There's not sort of food waste mixed into it, and it's not as odorous as just regular garbage. But again, it's sort of, oh, maybe this isn't so bad. But I imagine if it were to be formalized or there was some kind of procurement, again, I don't think anyone would put their necks out, any administrators upstate would put their necks up to say, sign us up.
I just wanted to follow up. I mean, it'll be very interesting to see. I mean, I happen to know about the pilot burn, and I think as soon as word got out that it was happening, a number of people in the environmental community mobilized to protest. So this was before, it was even a pilot. It was only going to be and then they were going to take a look at what the results were going to be. So, that response is out there. I think that there is a tremendous opportunity for the new mayor. Anybody who's coming in new has a real chance to, they've been elected, do whatever you have to do right up front. I think cost may be I continue to think cost may be a driver. When the woman who heads up the Sanitation Commission from Brooklyn, who is also running for, what's Tish James running for? Anybody know here? Follow their campaigns? She's running for public advocate. She chaired the sanitation committee at the city council, and she raised the cost issue. She said, in my neighborhood in Brooklyn, she's a woman of color, she said, in my neighborhood, we have all sorts of needs, and the cost of disposing of garbage, the way it's going up exponentially, is going to drive out dollars for the things my community cares about. And we're going to have to address those issues. So it's part of a discourse, and I think it might also be, getting at how do you create the incentives for recycling and waste prevention. I know all the, pros and cons, but the whole debate of some version of pay as you throw, you pay to get rid of the garbage, you can get rid of the recyclables for free, creates a set of incentives for you to
To
recycle.
put garbage in the recycling.
Well, it depends what your enforcement mechanisms are.
Well, it's really interesting because I want to talk about that for a second because
You know?
one of the things that we have
I mean,
in this
that's all
bifurcated
packages.
system is we have commercial waste that has to be paid to be taken away, and we have residential waste that just gets taken away for free. So one of the things I did want to ask you is what you guys thought in terms of whether there should be fees levied on the amount of garbage that we produce, which people in the suburbs who pay to have their garbage taken away have to pay it. They pay by bag, they pay by pickup, whatever they pay by. And many other municipalities around the world require it too. And I know there's dumping issues and all kinds of things that come out of that. But it does seem strange to me that we pay for electricity, we pay for water, we pay for a variety of things here, and yet we assume that this is a God-given right to throw out as much as we possibly want to and have it taken away every Tuesday, Thursday, and whatever else it is.
I'd like to take that if I could. We do have a free market pay-as-you-throw system for the commercial waste stream. And what that means is that corrugated cardboard and bulk metal are reliably separated. When paper markets are strong, so is paper. And that's about it. And that works very well from a pure free market perspective. When you move into considering pay-as-you-throw in New York City in the residential realm, you have to start with the fact that 70% of housing is multi-unit. And how are you going to address the lack of direct impact on a tenant for the amount of garbage that they produce? I can tell you that in recent months, the mayor's office was very interested in getting pay-as-you-throw proposals out of the Department of Sanitation. And so I and my colleagues gave a lot of thought looking at prior models. And we came to the conclusion that in order to make it viable in the residential realm, there would have to be some type of property tax rebate for the cost of purchasing bags or stickers. That a program of pay-as-you-throw would need to make it not painful to move from the taxpayer-funded system that we have to a different system, and also would need to work with existing collection infrastructures, which have to be manual collection in this city. However, the mayor's office wanted to institute, along with a program of this type, an extensive set of exemptions for buildings and institutions to participate in or have to pay for collection based on a rather untenable plan of self-reporting of diversion. So it was actually quite shocking to me that this could be seriously considered, and I'm happy now to be able to speak about it openly. But the idea was that a building would demonstrate through self-reporting that they had attained a 30% diversion rate. I'm not sure over what time period, but they would report this on the web, and as a result of achieving that building level diversion rate, they would have their collection fees waived. And this was a method of overcoming some of the anticipated political resistance of this type of system. And that is, as far as I know, where it stands with the deputy mayor for operations.
You do realize that at one point in time in this city, you didn't pay for your water separately. You didn't get a water bill. It was part of your general so there is a model for moving to a system like this in the city with water.
Right. And water is an interesting example for other reasons because the whole entire system is funded separately, essentially off the books, and that
Right.
begs questions of capital investment and how you have enough money to do what you need to do. One of the things I think, because in part we have, I'm assuming, I know we have some folks interested in real estate and urban planning, and I know this is a topic that's near and dear to Venetia's heart and to mine, is siting, and I think Marcia mentioned it, somebody mentioned it, siting, and particularly waterfront siting, and we were talking before about how important it is to have that access to the water. And of course, one of the things that's happening in this city and has been happening for the last decade is this, rediscovery of the several hundred miles of New York City's waterfront that was historically really the back door. It was the land that was zoned, for industrial uses, for, yicky uses. And it's really only of late that we're discovering that it's a great place to put parks. It's a great place, or it was a great place until Sandy, to put fancy apartments. I think people are realizing that maybe parks are a better thing to put there than housing. But, we had no qualms about, building Battery Park City out into the sea and doing a number of other things on the waterfront that are certainly much fancier than the way people used to think about the waterfront. And so one of the things I wanted to sort of pose to the panel was how they think that tension between the rediscovery of the waterfront for both residential and recreational purposes fits with the idea that really we need to think about preserving places on the waterfront for these kinds of transfers and other infrastructure uses as well. But particularly I wanted to talk about garbage transfer, because I know the reactivation of these marine transfer stations is only made possible by the fact that they existed before they were used for garbage. To actually site a new one in a community, in any borough in this city, would be a Herculean and probably impossible task, or would have been. So I just want to open up to thinking about what that, how we think about that, or should think about that going forward.
Yeah, if you think about siting a waste transfer station on the waterfront, there are two pieces. There's the facility itself, but then there's how the garbage gets to that facility. And I think that ended up being a large part of the debate, is that you by necessity have hundreds of trucks converging on one point. And this happens at every waste transfer station in the city. And as Marcia was saying, in sort of the current regime, it's concentrated in low-income communities of color in East Williamsburg, Greenpoint, and the South Bronx. And nobody's really questioning the fact that thousands of trucks converge on these places a day, moving everything from frozen fish to concrete. But when you take that equation and you put it into a waterfront park, like on the west side of Manhattan, where we were looking to site a recycling marine transfer station at Gansevoort Street, which is around Houston Street-ish, and one near on the Upper East Side at 91st Street on the waterfront. The conversation about trucks converging right next to children's playgrounds takes on a very different and difficult aspect, I think, that really brought the equity conversation that Marcia raised to a point. But the facility itself, maybe I'm optimistic and naive, and this is where, Kate, you asked about other cities and what they're doing. I do feel like there are examples, in particular in certain European countries, where infrastructure it becomes a creative architectural exercise, and it becomes something that is integrated into a community rather than shunned to the edges of a community as we tend to do here. And I think that, again, thinking about future architects and designers, I know, Kate, you solicited some great ideas for architects about what does a waste transfer station look like that is integrated into a park in a way that is aesthetically compatible and is environmentally responsible. And I think that the Riverbank State Park, for those people who know it, up in Harlem on the west side in the 130s, that's a wastewater treatment park with a massive park on top with roller rinks and basketball courts and all kinds of amenities functioning right over sewage digestion. So I think that engineers and architects and open space planners have shown that it could be done. So I think there's a challenge there on the facility side that I think is up to architects and designers, but there's an irreducible fact that you're going to have a lot of trucks congregating in one place that becomes an equity. Like, why is it okay for some neighborhoods to have a whole lot of trucks and not others?
If I could just follow up on that, it really has to do with your vision of the waterfront. What is a vibrant waterfront? There are those at a certain moment in time who espoused the, what was it, the emerald necklace, you know, so that there just should be a ribbon of green around Manhattan. If you go to Amsterdam, you go to a lot of cities, the waterfronts are very vibrant, but they include infrastructure, I mean, a host of different things. So it has to do with what your sort of vision of what a vibrant waterfront is. On the issue of the trucks that will initially go into those, you know, the marine transfer stations, 91st Street or Gansevoort, those were transfer stations before. And asphalt green existed while that marine transfer station was currently there. So I think it's a design challenge as well with the marine transfer station and trucks. I mean, do they queue, can you design it so they queue inside? I mean, how do you, it's a problem. How could you solve that problem?
But also the fact that we have highways ringing our, you know, in Manhattan in particular, right, that if you look at the proposed 91st Street Marine Transfer Station or the Gansevoort one in the West Village, you've got the West Side Highway and right, you've got the FDR going right by these same playgrounds in question, and the number of trucks going to the marine transfer stations are a literal drop in the bucket compared to the highways that are whizzing by these children as they play on their play fields. And again, it highlights, and you know, how emotional garbage is. It's when it becomes visible to a community that there's just this real sort of visceral reaction that I don't care if this is a drop in the bucket. I don't want this drop in my backyard.
So I want to ask the panel, each of them, one question more, and then we'll open it up because I know folks in the audience have a bunch of questions. So if we're looking forward, we've talked about a bunch of issues that sort of will frame the issue. We talked about the technical issues of some of these technologies that are not necessarily ripe for the volumes of garbage that we need to handle and require sites that are that don't exist. We talked about the financial problem of it being so very expensive to get rid of the volumes we're talking about. We talked about the political problems of neighborhoods and other sorts of stuff. And I guess what I'd love to hear from each of you is which of those do you think is in some ways likely to be the most intractable, or the one that's most difficult to address in terms of changing the system that we now have into one that would be both more equitable and more efficient? I realize it's a really hard question, and I just, you know, if you had to put your energies in sort of one area. Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of obstacles to moving forward. Some of them are political, and we've talked about incineration in neighborhoods. Some of them are financial in terms of money, and some of them are literally, do we have the technology to do it? And I guess my question to you is, where should we be putting our emphasis and our sort of policy wonks and our energies, if we could?
Well, I guess I'd answer that a little bit differently than any one of the three, kind of building on what Venetia was talking about so eloquently of the surge of waste and the flow of waste in this mega city, this ultra-dense mega city, and how disasters bring up exigencies for treating it using some technologies that are readily at hand, and the fact that there are lack of markets for reuse and recycling in many cases. I would suggest that as we go forward politically and technologically and fiscally, we try and build on the existing infrastructure of collection that works very, very well in this city. And by that I mean the 3,000 or so trucks that traverse the streets every day in non-emergency times and pick everything up and move it to where it is, its destination is supposed to be at any one particular time. And I think when, at least from my standpoint, which is not so much thinking about siting, but thinking about alternatives to disposal, one of the big weaknesses of the environmental community is that they don't understand that flow, and they don't understand the beauties of that collection system and the necessity of that collection system. and that anything that we do needs to work to divert materials in that context and on a very big scale.
It's a really good point.
Yeah, and I would echo that and just give a big shout out to the Department of Sanitation. And the reason that most people don't think about garbage is because the department does such an amazing job of picking it up and getting it out of your site so quickly and efficiently. I think it's a really good question, Kate. I think the technology is there. I think the technologies are proven. Anaerobic digestion is a very proven technology. Waste to energy is a very proven technology. Some of the more novel thermal technologies like gasification or pyrolysis or thermal cracking as applied to like a big municipal solid waste stream maybe aren't as proven, but there's certainly, I don't think technology is the hurdle. I think it's on the economics. It's like with so many things, it's how are we, like kind of how do you envision a waterfront? How do we do the math? Do you know what I mean? Most landfills, I think, are guaranteed for about 100 years. I mean, I think if you look at the average landfill liner, I don't know that a company would give you more than I'm looking at Paul John, who works for DEC in the Division of Environmental Remediation. He's giving me props, so I'll go with that. But if you think about, we're putting a toxic stew into a hole in the ground that has a liner that's guaranteed for 100 years. When we start thinking about the cost benefit of what we do with our garbage, I think this sort of bigger picture accounting of sustainability has to be taken into account. Like Marcia brought up, the vehicle miles traveled, the emissions from trucks, the emissions from marine diesel, the emissions from locomotives, the methane in landfills, the imperfect capture of methane from landfills. And I think, just like Sandy, I was thinking today, it would really probably take a massive landfill breach somewhere for people to wake up and say, oh, you know what, it doesn't just go away when I put it in a hole in the ground. That is going to be there for generations. And we are potentially creating a toxic landscape for our children, our great-grandchildren to have to deal with. So I think we're a little bit in denial still that garbage goes somewhere when we throw it out. And if we could somehow capture those hidden costs of future remediation, of greenhouse gases, of particulate matter and vehicle miles traveled, I think we would be looking at a very different equation of $135 a ton. Like, to me, it's a little bit meaningless, $135 a ton, because what does it capture? And you could drive yourself crazy like those Swedish scientists who tried to figure out, like, is it better to reuse a cup or to, and they broke it down. Is it better to reuse a coffee cup or use a paper one? And they broke it down into such minute level of detail that actually they couldn't tell. And I'm not talking about that kind of accounting, but just trying to capture some of the externalities that are, in my mind, kind of the meaning of sustainability, I think we should be focusing on, because then we'll have a more informed debate about, what does this cost?
What are the trade-offs?
What are the trade-offs?
Yeah.
I run a political organization, so I'm obviously going to come back to politics. I think that political leadership needs to force a serious conversation about what are the optimal set of trade-offs between cost, environment, and equity in shaping this program, and putting them all on the table, that each option has different values, if you will, for each of those. And we simply there's never going to be a perfect solution, but we have to make one that balances those things off in an optimal fashion. And you simply need leadership to force that conversation, I think, in the city.
Great. Okay. Well, on that note, I don't know if we can put the lights up, because I know that there are folks that have questions for these guys.
Now we get to see your faces now that
Right. It's been very dark. I see a hand in green there, so I'll start right there. Yeah. I think there's a mic coming.
I really like elephants in the room. So I'm kind of stunned at only the very brief mention of composting. New York City, I thought, had 3 composting plants. One, I think, never opened, and the others only dealt with leaves or something. So if you want to do all these estimates, which I actually do, of methane and CO2 from landfills and all of that kind of stuff, one thing is to avoid these, avoid the anaerobic landfill altogether. And the composition of New York City's waste in particular, which was mentioned, I'm sorry, I forgot your name, but it's incredibly high. I mean, the food waste is spectacular. So that seems to me to be almost like a no-brainer. I don't know what it would take to restart those plants. And the Europeans are separating green waste all the time, but it is never voluntary. It's just the law, and people just do it. So I'd like to put the composting story in.
I'm very glad you brought that up, because I'm a huge fan of composting. And that's why I noted the 62% compostable fraction. To answer your immediate question about the plants, there is one enclosed composting facility at Rikers Island. There are 2 outdoor composting facilities and one that is still under litigation because of community opposition. The reason that those sites only take leaves and yard waste is because, for many of the same reasons that we've been talking about, other facilities having siting problems, that people don't want them nearby. But I would agree with you that composting is, provided you can find a facility to receive it, and you can work out a system of source separation that works in New York City, and not an idealized single-family home comparison city. That there is a great deal of potential for that. But you need to think about it on a large scale, because frequently when we face these challenges of siting, of transportation, of separation, there's the temptation to move to things like food scrap drop-off at Union Square and home composting, which are things that I do myself, and I love them, and I highly promote them as very, very enriching activities, but there is simply no way that we're ever going to put any measurable dent in our waste through that approach to composting.
And I'll get a little wonky on you here, because when I worked at the Department of Sanitation, I was actually the deputy director of composting. So I'm also a huge advocate of composting, but want to draw the distinction between composting and anaerobic digestion, which was mentioned as a method for dealing with you called it the biogenic, is that good? I like that. I like that word. But if you think about, I think, what is it, 65% of the waste stream is sort of readily biodegradable-ish? 62% of the waste stream is readily biodegradable. Composting is an aerobic process. Aerobic microbes actually produces carbon dioxide. Whereas anaerobic digestion, which is happening not in the presence of oxygen, those microbes, they produce a synthesis gas, which is largely methane, but generally that gas can be captured and again in these processes and used for energy. So I think it's important to draw that wonky distinction. Although I think it's never going to be a way that we manage in that source separated way, manage our waste stream, maybe in the way that San Francisco does, for the reasons Samantha gave about our housing stock and just those kinds of factors in the city. But I am tremendously encouraged by how many community compost programs are starting up around the city, and it's really something that I feel like that has been pioneered by people like the Lower East Side Ecology Center for the past 30 years, but you see it blossoming in many neighborhoods in Brooklyn and Manhattan and the Bronx, where you just have sort of spontaneous drop-offs and community gardens really embracing composting in a way that I think is encouraging.
Great. Yep.
I would like to know where the data that you presented at the beginning have been taken from, all the data of the percent of garbage or, the daily New York waste collection? Because it wasn't mentioned in any
All
slide.
of the information that was up there is publicly available. If you go to the Department of Sanitation website, you can find a lot of material, and there's several other sources. So this is all very...
No, not to say that it wasn't public, but to say if it was recent, how many years ago.
Oh, a lot of the data, some of the data was 2006, when
Okay,
the
yeah.
solid waste management plan was produced, because that's when a lot of the information there, although some of it was more recent, because the volume of garbage obviously changes with the economy. So if you want some more detailed information, I can get you the specific year, and if you just drop me a card and get you.
Thank you. And I have another question.
Sure.
Can I say? So the other thing is now the Department of Sanitation has a new chief. I want to ask if you saw any change and what you are expecting out of it. And then there is the other part is instead the behavioral attitude of the people, that in New York is never enforced a responsible attitude towards recycling. And the fact is that, for example, Bloomberg, when it erased completely the program, basically erased 20 years of habits of people trying to recycle. And these things, you pay a price, and the price is that nowadays New York is not still recycling as it was recycling before. And so I think that the solution will be, have to be differentiated, and probably not only one solution, but many solutions will contribute to this problem. And the behavioral aspect, as you can study in any European country, has been one basic part of all the problem of the garbage. So.
I don't know particularly about changes in the department. You're the most recent.
The new head.
The new chief, as you call him, is the deputy commissioner for sustainability, who was appointed to the Department of Sanitation. Ron Gonen is a visionary, energetic leader. In terms of some of the behavioral impacts that you're talking about, he has chosen to focus on very symbolic but very high-profile. And I say symbolic in the sense that they're addressing very small tonnages of materials, but they are very high profile and very exciting. So things like public space recycling bins, composting projects in schools are two of the initiatives that he's behind. I think it is heartening that the Department of Sanitation is formalizing in its administrative structure a commitment to sustainability. However, to be perfectly blunt, I think that it's not so much the Department of Sanitation, but perhaps the mayor's office that needs to think more systemically than they are doing now, because they still appear to have rather an ad hoc approach to addressing these issues.
Other questions? Yep.
Can you just give a brief about what is done to the construction and demolition waste? Because that is almost as equal. I mean, it is greater than the residential and commercial waste.
That's a good question. I know you love
Yeah, that's a
Venetia.
very good question. And construction and demolition debris, or C&D debris as it's called, is sort of when buildings are dismantled, or, I mean, you see it all the time on the streets, those guys with the very small dumpsters, and they're taking the insides of buildings out. That is handled by the commercial waste system. You know, it's not handled by the Department of Sanitation generally, unless someone's doing a small household repair. And it is also handled at transfer stations throughout the city and throughout the region. Do you have the latest numbers on that stream?
Yeah, it's on the order of about 11,000 tons a day of material, and it does actually have a quite decent recycling rate of about a little over 50% of the material does get recycled.
Yeah, and I think with, you know, the LEED certification process, I think it's driving even more of that. But it is an industry historically that had financial incentives of its own to recover material.
Yes, up in the back there, everybody's got their hand up. You know what, if you want to just take the mic, that probably would make it a little bit easier for down here.
I was just wondering what the role of the private sector is in the current system, and if there's any room for it to alleviate any of the problems that you mentioned today.
Private sector in terms of any particular
In the residential, I guess.
do you mean in terms of
cost.
collection, or do you mean in
terms of cost? Like a private operator or private, I mean, I guess there was just no discussion of what exactly pays for the collection system and who is being hired to, pick up the garbage, truck the garbage, or put it on a barge.
Actually, you're asking an interesting question. There are, I think we made this clear before, the residential waste is picked up by New York City workers, Department of Sanitation. The commercial sector is picked up by private carters. There always has been a discussion about whether you should do some sort of competitive system to test whether the city workers are the preferable way to go, or whether one should consider a private operator on the residential side. It's a very complicated question involving union and labor negotiations. It also is informed by the fact that the city workers in the Department of Sanitation are also responsible for snow removal and a host of other things. But it's a very good question, because a lot of cities do rely on competitive bids in the private sector to manage both their residential and their commercial. New York City, for a host of reasons, doesn't.
Right, and that goes back to the history of how it happened. And there are people who have talked about a system that actually, might involve less truck miles if you actually had one set of trucks collecting in a geographic area, both the commercial and the residential waste, as happens in some systems. But right now there is that public collection, but in terms of, again, the disposal that goes beyond once it's collected and goes to a transfer station, there is again a blend of public and private in making sure it gets ultimately to those landfills, which of course are also private. So it's a kind of funky blended
I think
system.
to answer your first and most basic question of who pays for waste removal, if you're in a residential building in the city, you put it out and it's for free. Your tax dollars are what's paying for that service. Versus if you're in a restaurant, you need to pay a private carter per cubic yard to remove of that waste.
Yes.
The second speaker mentioned that moving trash by water is the best option. Is it in terms of cost or in terms of time saving?
It's really in terms, I was thinking, the cost can be so variable, obviously, depending on how far it's going. Generally, barging tends to be more cost competitive at longer distances than truck. But I was referring, not actually, in terms of time, barging is very slow. It took about 22 hours, it takes about 22 hours for a barge to get up to around the Albany region and back down to here. It's slow. But the efficiency is in terms of the fuel used per ton moved. Does that make sense? Yeah.
Yep, over here.
So you guys discussed anaerobic digestion, you discussed equity issues, and you discussed the challenges of paying for waste collection. So my question is really, why, if with anaerobic digestion you can actually obtain revenue from the selling of energy or fertilizer, whatever you choose to do, is the city not looking at creating anaerobic digestion centers throughout the city in terms of using that in a sense to kind of handle the equity issue by putting 2 or 3 per borough, having it centralized, and doing the same thing with very local pickup, local collection? And why is it not possible to do anaerobic digestion in New York City at any scale?
I just wanted to go back actually with the woman who asked a very good question about composting. The problem is to cite any garbage-related facility in this city is virtually impossible. And if I remember correctly, and it's long since I've done this, but if I recall the leaf composting program, which you think would be the most benign composting program, was shut down because the community didn't like it. People do not want any garbage-related facility in their neighborhood. I think one of the things that's been considered about anaerobic digestion is whether you cite something perhaps at Hunts Point, at the market at Hunts Point, where you have all this organic material right there, and you could deal with it on site. But there's still some challenges in the community. So nothing is easy.
But I see you saying why? Why don't?
Why?
Why don't?
Because New York City is, by any definition, a country unto itself.
Sure.
You need to take care of your garbage. So the question is,
Somebody needs to take care of your garbage, right? Just not us.
Well, it's interesting because one of the speakers said, and I can't remember who, maybe it was Marcia, was that these facilities, when and if they get cited, will very likely not be cited within the boundaries of the city. And there's a basic philosophical issue as to whether you feel as a city, we feel we need to take care of things physically within the boundaries of the city, or take care of them somewhere else. Our water doesn't come from within the city. We get it from somewhere else. And we pay for it in those communities.
You're saying why. I mean, think of an example close to home, and if you think of Morningside Park, and if the city said tomorrow, all right, we're gonna cite an anaerobic digestion facility in Morningside Park, and the technology is generally runs well, but there may be some times it generates some odors, and you're going to have about 150 garbage trucks convoy on this one spot within a 4 to 5 hour period. No problem, right?
You should put a gym there.
Yeah, right. Well, you can.
No, we can't.
I understand because it's New York City.
Well, I think lots of communities face these, not in my backyard, NIMBY challenges. But there's something very, as I said, visceral and emotional about garbage. Maybe it's a very deep biological instinct that we just want it away from us. But if you just maybe even as like a performance art piece, you could try to cite, go tell a community that you're going to put an anaerobic digestion facility in, and you see the reaction you get.
But I did want to jump in just on one thing. I mean, these facilities are cited in other parts of the world in urban areas. I mean, it is not it is perhaps determined by the American DNA, or at least the New York DNA, but not on the universal DNA. And in France, you have design competitions for your waste-to-energy facility. In Denmark, it's a question of scale. You have small facilities that actually are cited in neighborhoods of every economic range. In other places in the world, you do this.
And I think that is a question of design as well. I'm trying to think of there's a waste-to-energy facility somewhere in the Netherlands that was designed by Hundertwasser. Where's that? Vienna. Yeah, it is a beautiful facility to behold on the outside. It also has a reader that is telling you the emissions, so it's totally transparent. The data is in real time that you see this facility is emitting, and it's in the middle of town essentially, because it is it's architecturally relevant and it's transparent, and it's Europe.
There's lots of hands, and we can get into the whole question of why can things be done in Europe. Let me start right here, and then we'll move across the room.
My wife said I should keep my peace. But, in the last 12 years, I had close to 50 students studying different aspects that we talked about: composting, anaerobic, recycling. For instance, Kate, when you mentioned about Bloomberg stopped the recycling, I should tell you one of my students followed the recycling streams in 2000 before he took over, and we found out that of the recycling streams, 85% of the paper and the metal was actually being recycled. In other words, the residues were 15%. With plastic and with glass was 85%. 85% was going to landfill. So I think Bloomberg, by the way, we made that study available to Bloomberg. It was SIPA and engineering. And he stopped it and he did well for 8 months. And when he started it, he was more specific about what you should be recycling. You shouldn't be recycling things that have no market. Okay, I just want to say this now, that Marcia, 12 years ago, close to 12 years, invited me to a presentation like this, but it was at School of Journalism. I don't know if you remember this. You know,
I remember everything.
you know, Al Gore showed up after he had been defeated, at the election. No, I'm not saying this pejoratively because he's done a lot for the climate and so on. Since then, there have been 125, I call them waste to energy plants to distinguish them from the incinerators of the past, okay? But in Europe, they call them incinerators. 125 plants in Paris, in London, talking about Amsterdam, they're putting one with a ski slope on top and stuff like that. But here we're very exceptional people, and we cannot afford to have the infrastructure which serves us, although we have good examples like the one you mentioned, on 135th Street, which is it's a beautiful wastewater treatment plant. So what can we do about this? It has to be political will, you mentioned. Somebody has taken, but there is a small minority in the city of New York that every time Bloomberg says anything about waste to energy and why bring waste to energy? All things are good, recycling, composting, but we said there are limits. You mentioned 38%. The city of New York came up, 38% can be recycled. If everybody did everything, what is the other stuff? It's not so easy to put anaerobic digestion. Some of it, food waste, if you could separate it and so on, and green waste, when do we have them? Only in the summer months. There are no green waste except for Christmas, right? Okay. All right, so the writings on the wall, the 125 plants have been built since we talked about it, 12 years, because it's the only alternative for the post-recycling waste. You know, you recycle as much as you can, compost as much as you can. There's still going to be a large amount internationally. There's not one city in the world that has been able to avoid using waste to energy and recycling if they want to eliminate landfilling. And you know something? There are many countries that have avoided, have stopped landfilling by means of those two things. I'm sorry, it was not a question, but...
You're a font of information.
Great. Okay.
Thank
I
you.
think we probably should do maybe 3 more questions. So I'm not sure. Let's see. I see a hand right here with a red scarf.
Following up on both of those questions, I think we've learned about why it's so difficult to overcome a lot of the NIMBY issues. What are some strategies that government agencies and civil society and political advocacy groups that you represent can undertake and are undertaking to overcome these strategies other than just architecture and design of
To overcome, let me make sure we understand the question.
siting.
To overcome
the NIMBY siting issues,
the NIMBY issues.
especially with waste energy and anaerobic digestion plants.
Well, I think, I mean, and Marcia probably speak better than I can on this, but, you know, I think that the last solid waste management plan was a great example of it has to be a 5-borough effort, and it has to bring environmental justice advocates to the table, and it has to bring environmentalists to the table. I would wager it should bring designers and landscape architects to the table. But I think that it's the only way anything gets done in this city, even though it is painful, to get all of the interests in the room and around the kind of, you know, debate that Marcia was talking about let's revisit this plan. What makes sense about it? What costs are acceptable? What costs are not acceptable? And to really engage a very broad range of stakeholders, and at the end of the day, cut a political deal. You know, you're going to get this, I'm going to get this, you hate this, but I'm going to get enough people to gang up on you and say, you got to do it. And there's there's that level of politics that is really unavoidable, but it has to be, as Samantha was saying, not ad hoc. It has to be holistic, and it has to engage everybody, and ideally it would be underpinned by science.
Ideally. I would like to...
Ideally.
I just wanted to add, you know, sort of break down opposition on waste to energy. I mean, there's the environmental community in New York really, I think, needs to do some sort of soul searching on their position on waste to energy, which has not changed one iota in the last 30 years. You know, I mean, the same arguments are continued to be made, and part of them are in the frame, an environmentalist only can talk about recycling and waste prevention. The rest of the garbage stream is sort of outside their purview, even though it has very real impacts in terms of how you handle it. The other group, and this they have a real concern, is the environmental justice community. And the solid waste management plan, you know, was a real step in addressing the equity issues that they care about. I would argue, I hope no one from that community is here right now, because I would argue that really you have to have a conversation with the environmental justice community about how some of these alternatives can be used and will ultimately benefit them. And, you know, how some sort of conversion technology, whatever, small, whatever, can be cited in ways that their equity issues are taken care of. And you can sort of peel them off, because I would argue that they're the political force that counts in this city. The environmental community can be marginalized if you are the mayor of the city of New York. They cannot be marginalized if, you know, they're part of a broader environmental justice effort.
Right. Did you want to say something?
Yeah, I'd like to just throw in a slightly different perspective on all of this, because I've been studying both the environmental justice community and the zero waste community throughout the United States, as well as here in New York City. And I think it's important to acknowledge that the visceral reaction against conversion technologies in the zero waste community is not solely premised in concerns about risk or this rejection of waste facilities. It's also premised in a concern about who controls material resources. And the zero waste community sees community and local control over the transformation of materials into other materials as integral to a vision of zero waste and zero disposal. And rightly or wrongly, is pointing to conversion options as inherently and structurally threatening, that kind of model. And in the case that Venetia brought up, of the, was it the
Air curtain incinerators.
Air curtain, right. So you see, in a case of emergency, when you have a lot of wood waste that you have to deal with, what is it that is kind of the default? What can be moved in to take that waste easily and effectively? It's conversion technology. And what the zero waste community is concerned about, and if there's anybody here who'd like to speak up for it, please do, is that that potential of conversion is basically going to siphon and suck away potentially valuable resources that right now are being squandered in landfills, but in a zero waste vision need not be. So I think, and this is actually, as a sociologist, what I'm just going to be studying right now is these kind of discourses in the zero waste community and how that relates to questions of environmental justice. But we need to take it seriously.
Great. Question in the back there.
Hello. I wonder if there's a platform where this problem is addressed in a more interdisciplinary way than just disciplines like urban planning or the engineers from another perspective look to the problem. Is there a platform in the government from New York that addresses this problem where scientists, stakeholders, and what you've been saying just now about zero waste solutions come together and really think of a sustainable, comprehensive solution for this really big and interesting problem?
It's a really interesting question, because this is my personal view that there really hasn't been that platform. And part of the problem with the discussion of waste over decades in the city is that it really has been all about the politics and not really about the science. And the science has morphed and changed. And some of the discussions, if you take the energy industry as a sort of parallel world, some of the discussions that are happening now about the rethinking of nuclear power and how nuclear power stands up to other options, sort of marks a change in, you know, thinking about the science. And in terms of the science of waste, there's definitely room for that. There just isn't a very good vehicle here, although I think the Citizens Budget Commission and other folks have, and you know, Marcia and others have made an attempt to shed light on these issues.
Yeah, I think, and Marcia, you would know the date better than me, that there was, I think in the late 80s with the first solid waste management plan, the formation of solid waste advisory boards in each borough. Some of them are still active, some of them are less active, but it was an attempt to bring together businesses and advocates and citizens to monitor the solid waste management plan implementation and kind of continue the discourse about, you know, means and methods. It's something, again, that I think is sort of ripe for reinvigoration and reinvention, but tends to be, I think, citizen-driven, so.
Is there... Sorry, did you have a follow-up?
Yeah, I would say that not only like scientists or interest groups or certain actors should be involved, but also the packaging industry, the energy industry, industries that are interested in from composting and whatever, certain micronutrients or macronutrients are can be subtracted, that can be used in agriculture, for instance. All these sort of niches, when all these people are put together and forced to make to come to a solution, I think that would make a much better solution for the problem. But then there must be an incentive for all these parties to come together. Except, yeah, that's pretty difficult when everybody thinks about money, right?
Right.
That
we
was
have time for one last question, Jeff.
Yeah, Samantha touched on this a little bit. You know, absent of the sort of residential pay for your waste disposal reduction and the voluntary compliance, you know, sort of proposal, are there other sort of strategic, sort of low-hanging fruit in regards to sort of some of the taxes that could be levied on, say, bags or other things like that, that you guys would recommend potentially considering?
Yeah, I would recommend a 5-cent tax on plastic shopping bags. I know some people here disagree with me because they use them as garbage bags, but that's been shown to be incredibly effective in Ireland, for example. I would even go so far as to consider banning styrofoam, expanded polystyrene, and restaurant takeout. These are sometimes have unintended consequences of increasing consumption in other areas, but there actually is a very long history of consideration of either fees to help fund the solid waste management system, or taxes, or bans that has been considered and usually fought down by industry opposition in this city. And not to do self-promotion, but a book that I wrote recently gets into that history. It started in the 1970s when some of the most visionary people around recycling and the sanitation commissioner at the time were considering how we address problematic packaging and plastics in particular through those small fees.
If I could just throw out one other thing. I mean, the gentleman in the back raised a very interesting, sort of broadened our conversation or this discourse in a direction I think it needs to go. But they're just in a very narrower sense. You know, businesses are really taking a look at, you have to look at sort of material flow, which you have to look at your procurement policies, because your procurement policies inform your disposal policies. And just beginning to think in those terms, if you're an intelligent business, you want to have procurement policies that force your suppliers to take back packaging, to do a host of things, so that at the end of the day, you don't have to pay to get rid of it. So, I mean, on a narrower scale, I think we need to sort of blow this open and talk in that context.
Good, well, I'm glad we could end on a broad scale.
Right.
This is a broad set of issues. Just join me in thanking our panelists for coming.